My mother-in-law raised her champagne glass in front of 40 of her closest friends and said, "Everyone, meet Daniel's wife." Don't worry, no need to ask what she does, nothing worth repeating. Some women marry up. Some just marry someone patient enough to explain things twice. The room laughed. Not politely this time. Genuinely. Someone near the bar added, "At least she's decorative," and Diane didn't even bother pretending to correct them. She just smiled into her glass like she'd been waiting all night for someone else to say it for her. I smiled too. Set my glass down without a sound. 40 minutes later, I would have both hands inside a stranger's chest, on the marble floor of that same ballroom, while the woman who'd just called me decorative stood 3 feet away, screaming for anyone who actually knew what they were doing. But before that, I watched Daniel's jaw tighten, not at his mother, at me like I was the one who'd embarrassed him by existing in the room. He didn't correct her. He picked up his own glass and said, "Low enough for only the closest table to hear? She's sensitive about it. Let's not make it a whole thing." 6 years. 6 years of being introduced as Daniel's charity case, of watching Diane's friends look at me the way you look at a stain you're too polite to mention out loud. 6 years of letting an entire family believe I handed out pamphlets for a living, because I had learned a long time ago that some rooms don't deserve the truth until they're on their knees, begging anyone to save them. That night, standing in my heels at the edge of the ballroom, still hearing that laugh chasing me toward the buffet table, I felt my pager buzz once against my thigh. I didn't know yet that in under an hour, every person in that room would be looking at me the way you look at the only person standing between someone you love and a body bag. I just knew Diane Voss had finally said the one thing I'd never forgive. I want to explain how I got there, because none of it happened the way you'd expect. There was no single door that slammed. It was quieter than that. It was 6 years of small, deliberate erasures, each one so minor on its own that objecting to any single one would have made me the difficult woman at the table. I met Daniel Voss during my 2nd year of residency, at a fundraiser I only attended because a friend needed a +1. He was easy to like. He asked real questions and actually waited for the answers, which after 4 years of men who asked what I did for a laugh, felt like water after a drought. I told him I was in trauma surgery. He said that sounded terrifying and important, and he meant it. And for about 18 months, that was the whole relationship, a man who thought what I did was terrifying and important. Then I met his mother. Diane Voss ran Voss Family Health Partners, a mid-sized network of urgent care clinics and, more recently, a foundation she'd built around accessible community medicine, a phrase she used in every press release, and never once explained. She had a way of shaking your hand that made you feel like she was deciding, in real time, whether you were worth the calories it took to smile at you. The first time we met, she asked what I did. I told her, trauma surgery, currently finishing my fellowship, aiming for a chief position within 5 years. She nodded slowly, the way you nod at a child who's just told you they want to be an astronaut, and said, "That's a lot of blood for someone so small." I laughed, because I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. By the time Daniel and I got engaged, Diane had already decided who I was, and no version of the truth was going to move her off that story. In her telling, I was a nurse not incorrect enough to be a lie, just incomplete enough to be smaller than I was. When I corrected her once, gently, at a dinner with her board members, she laughed and said, "Doctor, nurse, they all wear the same scrubs, don't they?" and moved on to ask her son's business partner about his boat. I stopped correcting her after that. Not because I agreed with her, but because I noticed something. The more I insisted, the smaller the room made me. The one time I pushed back hard, at Thanksgiving, laying out my actual title, my actual hospital, my actual hours, Diane had looked at Daniel, not me, and said, "Is she always this intense?" And Daniel had laughed. A small laugh. An apology dressed as a laugh. That was the moment I understood the rules of this family. You could be resented for being ordinary, or you could be resented for being exceptional. But either way, you would be resented. And the only thing you controlled was whether they got to watch you flinch. So I stopped giving them anything to watch. I let Diane believe what she wanted. I let her introduce me at galas as Daniel's wife. She's in healthcare. Very sweet. The way you'd describe a golden retriever with a part-time job. I let her seat me next to the least important people at every dinner, tucked at the far curve of the table where the conversation dies early, and nobody minds if you check your phone. I let her buy me a single gift every Christmas. Always something small. Always something that said, without saying it, that she'd priced me correctly. A scented candle, a paperback, once, memorably, a coupon book for a spa she owned stock in. Meanwhile, I was quietly finishing my fellowship at one of the busiest Level 1 trauma centers on the East Coast. I made chief resident 2 years ahead of the usual track. I got asked to join the regional disaster response coordination team, which meant that beyond my hospital shifts, I was the person who got called when a highway pileup or a building collapse needed triage leadership on site, in real time, under a tent, in the rain, with people's lives arranged in front of me, like a puzzle that had 30 seconds to be solved. I published 2 papers on mass casualty triage protocols that other hospitals started citing in their own training manuals. At 34, I became the youngest chief of trauma surgery in my hospital's history. I told Daniel all of it. Every promotion, every milestone, every brutal double shift. He'd nod, say he was proud of me, and then go quiet whenever his mother was in the room. Like pride was something you could only afford in private. I never told Diane any of it. Not out of some grand strategic plan, at least. Not at first. It just became easier not to. Correcting her felt like handing her a weapon and asking her to please aim it more precisely next time. So instead, I built an entire life 2 hours away from her dinner table, a life she had no idea existed. And I let her believe I was still exactly as small as she needed me to be. The erasure had a rhythm to it. Once I started paying attention. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in 3 specific moments. I can still name, each one a little bolder than the last, because Diane had learned, correctly, that nothing ever stopped her. The first came the year Daniel and I got married, when the foundation printed its annual holiday card, a glossy, professionally shot photograph of the entire Voss family, arranged on the steps of the country club, Diane at the center in a cream coat. Daniel's siblings and their spouses fanned out around her like petals. I wasn't in it. When I asked, gently, why I'd been left out of a photograph that had clearly been scheduled weeks in advance, Diane looked genuinely puzzled. The particular puzzlement of someone who has never once had to account for her own oversights. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't think you'd want to be photographed in your work clothes," she said. Though I'd worn a dress that day, the same dress everyone else had worn, and though the photographer had, in fact, asked twice where Daniel's wife had gone, I let it go. I told myself it was an accident. I have since stopped believing Diane Voss was capable of accidents that benefited her this consistently. The second came 2 years later, at the press launch for the Foundation's first mobile health van, a real event, cameras and all. City officials in attendance, the kind of thing that ends up on the 6 o'clock news. I found out about it from Daniel's sister, 3 days after it happened, in a text that said, almost as an afterthought, "You should have been there. It was a big deal." When I asked Daniel why I hadn't been invited, he said his mother had told him the guest list was medical professionals and major donors only, and that she'd assumed, since I worked in a hospital, I'd be too busy with actual shifts to attend a daytime press event anyway. It took me a week to learn that 2 of Diane's tennis partners, women who had never once set foot in a clinic, had been seated in the front row. The third came at the gala itself, months later, in front of 40 people and a raised champagne glass, and by then I had stopped being surprised by any of it. I had simply started keeping a private, careful accounting of every slight. The way you'd track vital signs on a patient you suspected was deteriorating slowly enough that no single reading would alarm anyone until, eventually, all of them together painted a picture no one could keep pretending not to see. I want to tell you about the week before the gala, too, because it wasn't all momentum and discovery. There was a night, about 4 days after Priya's first call, when I sat alone in my hospital office after a 14-hour shift, the overhead light buzzing, a lukewarm coffee going cold beside a stack of billing printouts I didn't yet understand the full shape of. I remember taking my shoes off under the desk, resting my bare feet on the cool tile, and just breathing for a while, not thinking about fraud, not thinking about Diane, not thinking about anything at all except the particular relief of an empty room where no one needed anything from me. I ate a granola bar I found in my coat pocket, stale, probably 3 weeks old, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the best 5 minutes of that entire month. Not because anything happened in it, because nothing did. Some nights, the only thing that keeps a person upright is the 15 minutes where nobody is asking them to be anything. That worked, more or less, for 6 years. Until the Foundation Gala. I want to back up and tell you about the phone call, because it matters later. 3 weeks before the gala, I got a call from a woman named Priya Okafor. Priya had been a patient advocate at my hospital for a decade. She was the person families got sent to when insurance denied a claim and someone needed to fight it, quietly and relentlessly, until the hospital got paid and the patient didn't go bankrupt. Priya and I had worked dozens of cases together over the years, mostly veterans whose care fell into administrative gaps between the VA and civilian hospitals. She called me on a Tuesday night, and her voice had a flatness to it. I'd only heard from her once before, the week her father died. "I need you to look at something," she said, "and I need you to tell me if I'm imagining it." She emailed me a set of billing records the next morning. They belonged to patients who'd been treated at 3 Voss family health clinics over the past 18 months, all of them veterans, all of them referred through a program the foundation had launched with enormous fanfare called Homefront Health, which promised free preventive care and chronic disease management for former service members with gaps in coverage. The records showed something strange. Patients were being billed through a secondary insurance code. Priya had never seen used this way for procedures that, according to their own chart notes, had never happened. A diabetic screening that was never performed. A cardiac consult that didn't exist. Small amounts, individually. $80 here, $140 there. But multiplied across the volume of patients, the foundation was proudly citing, in every press release, over 4,000 veterans served. The amount stopped being small. I spent the next 2 weeks doing something I'd never expected to do. Quietly building a case against my own husband's family, using nothing but my medical license, my hospital's compliance office, and Priya's records. Working at night after 12-hour shifts, at my kitchen table, while Daniel slept upstairs, not knowing. I want to be honest about why I didn't tell him right away. It wasn't distrust, not at first. It was that I needed to know what I was looking at before I said anything out loud. Because once I said it out loud, I couldn't take it back, and I understood exactly what it would cost, not just Diane, but Daniel and the family, and possibly a version of my marriage I still, at that point, wanted to save. So I kept working, quietly. The same way I'd built the last 6 years of my career while everyone at that family's table thought I filed insurance paperwork for a living. The night of the gala was the official launch of Homefront Health's expansion phase, 150 new clinic partnerships across 3 states, according to the program printed on heavy cardstock at every table setting. Diane had rented the grand ballroom of the Fairmount Hotel downtown. There were 400 guests. There was a string quartet. There was a step-and-repeat banner with the foundation's logo, in front of which Diane posed for photos with a rotating cast of local news anchors and city council members, her hand resting on the shoulder of whichever veteran had been selected that evening to stand beside her and look grateful. I'd already found what I needed by then. I had it printed, 3 copies, in a manila folder in my car. Because Priya had insisted physical copies, Ren, always physical copies, servers get wiped. And because some part of me, some old military instinct left over from a father who'd taught me to always have a backup plan, agreed with her. I hadn't told anyone I was bringing it. I hadn't decided, walking into that ballroom in a navy dress I'd bought, specifically because it had pockets deep enough to hold a folded printout, exactly when I would use it, or if I would use it at all that night. Some part of me still thought maybe I'd wait. Maybe I'd talk to Daniel first, privately, and give the family a chance to fix it before it became public. I want you to know that. I wasn't looking for the moment. I was hoping I wouldn't need one. Diane made sure I needed one. The toast happened around 8:30. She'd had 2 glasses of champagne, and her friends had had more than that. And I've since learned that cruelty, in that particular social class, only really comes out once the second bottle's been poured. Before that, it's all coded language and sideways compliments. After that, you get the real thing. "Everyone, meet Daniel's wife," she said, raising her glass toward our table, toward me, in front of 40 people, most of whom I recognized from 6 years of being introduced this exact way, smaller each time. "Don't worry. No need to ask what she does, nothing worth repeating. Some women marry up. Some just marry someone patient enough to explain things twice." I want to describe the laugh precisely, because I've replayed it more times than I'd like to admit. It wasn't scattered. It was immediate, and it was loud, and it had the particular texture of a room that had been waiting for permission. Someone near the bar I never found out who said, "At least she's decorative, loud enough to carry," and Diane didn't correct them. She smiled into her glass, satisfied, like she'd finally gotten someone else to say the quiet part for her. I looked at Daniel. I want to tell you I expected him to say something. Some small correction. Some version of actually, Mom. But he didn't look at me either. He picked up his own glass, took a sip, and said, quiet enough that only our table heard it, "She's sensitive about it. Let's not make it a whole thing." I felt something in my chest do a very specific thing. Not break. Settle. Like a decision that had been circling for weeks had finally found somewhere to land. I smiled. I set my glass down on the white tablecloth without a sound. The way you set down something you've decided you no longer need to hold carefully. I didn't reach for the folder yet. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds in the retelling, like I stood up right then and delivered some perfect, cutting monologue while the whole room gasped. That's not what happened. What happened is that I excused myself to the ladies' room, sat in a stall for 4 minutes with my forehead against the cool metal of the door, and thought about walking out to the parking lot and driving home and letting the whole thing go unsaid. One more time. The way I'd let 6 years of it go unsaid. I didn't get the chance to decide either way, because when I came back out, the ballroom had changed shape. There was a cluster of people near the dessert tables, too tight, too fast-moving. The particular choreography of a crowd that's just watched something go wrong. I heard it before I saw it, the specific sound of a chair scraping back hard. A woman's voice pitched up into something that wasn't quite a scream yet, but was headed there. I moved before I decided to move. That part of me doesn't ask permission anymore. It hasn't for a long time. A man was on the floor near table 12, mid-60s, gray at the temples, the kind of good suit that gets tailored twice a year. Later I'd learn his name was Harold Pruitt, a city council member, one of the distinguished guests whose photo Diane had needed for the press release. His face had gone the particular gray-white color I've seen 1,000 times and still can't fully describe to people who haven't seen it. His wife was on her knees next to him, saying his name over and over in a voice that had already started grieving him. I didn't run. Running wastes seconds you need for thinking. I walked fast, kicked off my heels, 3 steps out, because heels are useless on marble, and I've made that mistake exactly once in my life, and I was on the floor next to him before most of the room had processed that something was happening at all. No pulse at the carotid. No respiration. I called it out loud. "He's in cardiac arrest. Someone call 911. I need this table cleared now, and I want you to know that my voice didn't shake, because it never does anymore. Not since the ship. Not since the years of doing exactly this in far worse light, with far worse equipment." Someone screamed. I think it was Diane, but I genuinely don't know, because I wasn't looking at faces. I was counting compressions. There's a strange privacy inside a chest compression, even with 40 people watching. It's just you and the rhythm and the small, terrible math of how many minutes a brain can survive without blood. I heard, distantly, someone yelling for a defibrillator. And I heard, more distantly still, Diane's voice high, cracking. Nothing like the voice from the toast, saying, "Does anyone actually know what they're doing? Someone needs to know what they're doing." And that's when I heard my name. My real title, spoken by someone else, for the first time in that ballroom. In 6 years. "Dr. Calloway's got him. Everyone back up. Let Dr. Calloway work." I looked up for exactly 1 second. It was Marisol Reyes, a trauma nurse I'd worked alongside for 4 years before she left for a private cardiac unit, someone I hadn't seen in over a year, who I later learned was there that night as a guest of one of the honored veterans, a man she'd cared for during his own hospital stay. She was already moving toward me. Already reaching past a stunned server for the hotel's AED kit someone had finally located. Already falling into the exact rhythm we used to fall into together on the worst nights of residency, like no time had passed at all. I don't know how to describe what happened to the room in that moment, except to say that it went very quiet, and then it went very loud. And somewhere inside that noise I heard Diane say, to no one, to everyone, "Doctor." She said doctor. I didn't stop to look at her face. I was watching the monitor Marisol had strapped on, watching the rhythm resolve into something survivable, feeling the specific, unglamorous relief of a chest that starts moving on its own again. I called for the compressions to switch every 2 minutes, the way you're trained to, because fatigue kills rescuers as surely as it kills patients. And Marisol and I traded off without a word between us, the muscle memory of 4 years of overlapping shifts doing the talking neither of us needed to do out loud. Someone, a server, I think, still holding a tray of untouched canapes, hovered at the edge of the circle we'd created, and I told him, without looking up, to get everyone back another 10 feet, and to find out if the hotel had an AED anywhere closer than the one Marisol was already tearing open. My hands found their rhythm the way they always do. 30 compressions, hard and fast, the sternum giving under my palms with the specific resistance I've felt 1,000 times and never once gotten used to, followed by the pause for the mouth shield someone had produced from an actual first aid kit tucked behind the coat check. The dress was a problem I dealt with by not dealing with it. I heard the seam at my shoulder give somewhere around minute 4. I felt champagne someone had knocked over a full glass and the scramble soak through the knee of my stockings. None of it registered as anything other than background noise. That's the part people never understand about codes. The room around you disappears. There is no ballroom. There is no Diane. There is a chest, a rhythm, and a clock running down in your head whether you look at it or not. When the rhythm on the monitor finally organized itself into something with a pulse behind it, I felt the specific, quiet relief that never once, in 11 years of doing this, has translated into anything as dramatic as it looks in movies. No cheering. No collapse into someone's arms. Just a long breath out, and Marisol's hand briefly on my shoulder, and the sound of Harold Pruitt's wife saying his name in a completely different register than she had 90 seconds earlier, relief instead of grief, which sound almost identical until you've heard enough of both to know the difference. Harold Pruitt was breathing on his own by the time the paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. 9 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch the second I stood up, out of habit, the way you clock a shift. I stood up. My dress was ruined someone's champagne, his blood, the particular grime of a ballroom floor. My hair had come half loose. I hadn't noticed any of it happening. The room was staring at me. Not the way they'd stared an hour earlier, when Diane called me decorative and 40 people laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all year. This was a different kind of staring. The kind that recalculates everything it thought it knew, in real time, and doesn't like what the new numbers say. Diane was the first to speak. Her voice had lost every ounce of the polish it had at the podium. You're a doctor. A real doctor. Chief of trauma surgery, I said. Mercy General. 6 years. I watched her do the math. 6 years was every year she'd known me. Daniel had come up behind her, his face doing something complicated, somewhere between shock and shame, and, underneath both, something that looked almost like relief, like a weight he hadn't admitted to carrying had finally been set down. Ren, he said. You never. I told you, I said. Every year, every promotion, you knew. He didn't argue. That was the first honest thing that happened between us that night. I want to pause here, because there's a version of this story where the ballroom is the climax, where the ambulance pulling away is the ending, where everyone learns their lesson under the chandeliers and the credits roll. That's not what happened. What happened is that the real reveal, the one that actually mattered, hadn't even started yet. I went home that night still in my ruined dress, and I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, Daniel came and sat on the edge of the bed, and he said the thing I'd been braced for without knowing I was braced for it. You should know something, he said. Before this goes any further. Before you decide what you're going to do with whatever it is you've been doing at that kitchen table for the last 3 weeks. I hadn't told him about the folder. I hadn't told him about Priya, about the billing codes, about any of it. How long have you known I was looking into something? I asked. A while, he said. I found the printouts. In your bag. I wasn't looking. I was getting your keys. He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who'd been rehearsing a confession for longer than one night. I've known about Homefront Health for almost a year, Ren. Not all of it. Enough of it. Enough to know the billing wasn't clean. Enough to know the veteran numbers and the press releases were inflated. I found out at a board meeting I wasn't supposed to be paying attention to, and I told myself it wasn't my business, that Mom's people handled compliance, that it wasn't my job to. To what? I said. Say something? I didn't want to be the son who burned it down, he said. I told myself someone else would catch it. Auditors, regulators, someone whose job it was. It became my job, I said, the second Priya called me. Would you have said anything? I asked. If Priya hadn't called me, if I'd never found it myself, would you ever have told me? He was quiet long enough that the silence answered before he did. I don't know, he finally said, and I remember thinking that was, in its own small way, the most honest sentence he'd said to me in 6 years. Not a defense, not a justification, just an admission that he genuinely hadn't decided, and that the not deciding had been its own kind of decision all along. You laughed at the table, I said. Tonight, when she called me decorative. I know. Why? He rubbed his face again, and when he spoke, his voice had gone smaller, closer to the voice I remembered from the fundraiser where we met, before 6 years of his mother's dinner table had worn something down in him too. Because it's easier, he said. It's always been easier to laugh along than to be the one who stops the table. I've been doing it since I was a kid. You were the first person I did it to that I actually loved. I didn't say anything to that for a long moment. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles over a room when someone finally tells you the truth about a thing you'd already understood, but hadn't heard confirmed out loud. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the floor finishing a drop it started falling through a long time ago. He didn't have anything else to say after that. I don't think there was anything else to say. I've turned that conversation over 100 times since. And the part that still sits heaviest isn't that Diane built something rotten and dressed it up as charity. People like Diane exist everywhere, and eventually most of them get caught by something: an auditor, a whistleblower, a bad month. What sits heaviest is that Daniel knew, and chose the version of loyalty that asked nothing of him. The same version of loyalty that had him laughing quietly at his mother's table while she called me decorative for 6 years. Complicity doesn't always look like a lie. Sometimes it just looks like a man staying very still. I filed my findings with the hospital's compliance office the following week, and Priya filed a parallel complaint through the Veterans Advocacy channel she worked under, and within 11 days a joint state and federal review had opened into Voss Family Health Partners' billing practices. I want to be precise about numbers here, because vague outrage is easy, and specific facts are what actually convict people. The review eventually identified $211,000 in fraudulent billing codes submitted against veteran patients over an 18-month period. It identified that the over 4,000 veterans served figure Diane had repeated at every gala and every press conference had been inflated by nearly 60%, counting patients who'd attended a single free blood pressure screening as fully enrolled in a program that, in practice, barely existed. 3 of the clinic administrators lost their licenses. Voss Family Health Partners lost its nonprofit status and its foundation registration within 4 months. Diane herself was never criminally charged. The fraud, in the end, was structured carefully enough by people beneath her that it landed on employees, not on her personally, which is its own kind of lesson about how these things usually go. But she lost her board seat. She lost the foundation she'd built her entire public identity around. And she lost, more than anything, the specific kind of social currency that had let her sit at the head of every table in that city and decide, out loud, who was worth the calories it took to smile at. The compliance officer who took my initial report, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Fitch who'd spent 31 years auditing hospital billing before most of the fraud detection software he now relied on had even existed, told me something during our second meeting that I've thought about often since. He said most fraud cases like this one don't end with a single dramatic discovery. They end because somebody who could have looked away for one more year decided, for reasons that were usually personal and rarely noble-sounding out loud, not to. He didn't know about the toast. He didn't know about Diane, or the marriage, or any of it. He just meant it generally, as a piece of institutional wisdom. And I remember sitting across from him in his cramped office with its stacks of manila folders, not so different from the one I'd carried into that ballroom, thinking that he'd accidentally described my entire 6 years in a single sentence. I saw her exactly once during the months the investigation unfolded, at a mediation session Daniel and I attended as our marriage came apart, in its own slow, unglamorous way, not because of the affair or the money, but because of the 6 years of quiet I'd let build up between us like sediment. And because trust, once you learn someone chose comfort over you at the exact moment it mattered, doesn't rebuild on schedule the way people in movies pretend it does. Diane sat across from me in a lawyer's conference room, thinner than I remembered. Her hands folded very precisely on the table the way they'd always been at every gala, at every dinner. At every moment she decided what version of me the room would be allowed to see. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. But she said one thing, near the end, when the lawyers had stepped out and it was just the 2 of us and Daniel, looking at his hands. I always knew you were smarter than you let on, she said. I just assumed that meant you were dangerous. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. That sentence told me everything I'd spent 6 years trying to understand about her, that she hadn't underestimated me by accident. She'd underestimated me on purpose. The way you deliberately misname something you're afraid of. Because a small thing is easier to sit across a table from than a dangerous one. I moved out of the house, Daniel, and I had shared 3 weeks after that meeting. I didn't take much. I took my medical texts, my father's old stethoscope that I'd carried through residency, and never once used because it was a hand-me-down, not because it was clinically useful, and a single photograph from our wedding that I kept not out of sentiment but because I wanted, someday, to be able to look at it and recognize the version of myself who thought being small at the right tables was a fair price for being loved. Harold Pruitt survived. I checked weeks later, discreetly, through a colleague at the hospital he'd been transferred to. Full recovery, no permanent cardiac damage, back on the city council within 2 months. He sent a handwritten card to my hospital that I still have in a drawer, and in it he wrote that he didn't remember much about that night except waking up and being told a woman in a blue dress had saved his life before the paramedics even arrived. I don't think he ever learned who I was married to, or why the woman in the blue dress happened to be at that particular gala, wearing that particular dress, with a folder in her pocket she hadn't decided whether to use. Priya Okafor still calls me sometimes, still working her way through billing records at odd hours, still fighting the same quiet, unglamorous battles on behalf of people who don't know anyone is fighting for them. We had dinner a few months after everything settled, and she asked me, somewhere between the appetizer and the check, whether I regretted any of it, the years of silence, the choice to let Diane believe I was small, the way the whole thing finally came apart in public, in the worst possible room, in front of the worst possible people. I told her the truth. I didn't regret the years of silence. I understood by then that they weren't wasted. They were the only way I could have kept building the life that eventually mattered, undisturbed by a woman who would have found a way to diminish every piece of it if she'd known it was there to diminish. What I regretted was smaller and stranger than that. I regretted that it took Harold Pruitt's heart stopping on a marble floor for the truth to finally have somewhere to land. I would have preferred a quieter door. I just never got offered one. These days I live alone, in an apartment 11 minutes from the hospital, small enough that I never have to wonder whether anyone in it is deciding, in real time, what version of me they're willing to let exist. I kept my father's stethoscope on a hook by the door, not because I use it, but because it's the only object left from that entire chapter of my life that never once lied to me about what it was. Most nights, I come home from a shift, heat up whatever's in the refrigerator, and eat standing at the counter because there's no one to sit across from and no reason to pretend otherwise. It isn't a sad ritual. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds. It's just quiet. In the specific way a room is quiet after you finally set something down that you spent 6 years carrying without letting anyone see the weight of it. I still think about the toast sometimes. Not with anger. Not anymore. The anger burned off somewhere in the 11 days between filing my report and watching the investigation open. What's left is something closer to clarity. Diane Voss spent 6 years deciding what I was worth out loud, in rooms full of people who agreed with her, because agreeing was easier than looking closely. And it turned out the truth had been sitting there the entire time, patient, unbothered, waiting for exactly one moment when the room would have no choice but to look closely, whether it wanted to or not. I don't know if Daniel and I will ever be more to each other than two people who once shared an address and a set of complicated relatives. I don't think that question keeps me up the way it used to. What keeps me up sometimes, late, after a hard shift, isn't him at all. It's the specific memory of Diane's face in that lawyer's conference room, saying I always knew you were smarter than you let on, like it was an accusation instead of the truth. I think about how many people in my life have made that same calculation, deciding my quiet was proof of my smallness, instead of proof that I'd simply chosen, very carefully, who got to see the rest of me. Marisol and I still work together occasionally, whenever the hospital pulls a joint disaster response drill, or whenever a bad enough night needs two people who don't have to talk to know what the other is thinking. She never asked me much about that night at the gala, beyond a single question, weeks later, over coffee in the staff lounge. Was that your mother-in-law? The one who was screaming? I told her it was. She just nodded, stirred her coffee, and said, "Good code, though. 9 minutes is good." That was the entire conversation. I've never loved anyone's restraint more than I loved hers in that moment. The way she let the only thing that actually mattered be the thing we talked about. I don't perform for those rooms anymore. I don't need to. I learned, the hard way, in the worst possible ballroom, in front of the worst possible people, that being underestimated was never actually a wound. It was just information about who was doing the underestimating, and eventually, if you're patient enough, the truth finds its own 9 minutes to arrive, whether the room is ready for it or not.